Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab, all on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Well, welcome everybody. As one of our tech people just said, people are still shuffling in, which is kind of a great metaphor for Zoom meetings, I think. So we're going to wait just a minute while until it looks like we've leveled off in terms of the number of participants joining, and then we'll get started. But the good news is that all of the people that are going to be talking are here, so we don't have to wait for them. And it looks like, well, we haven't maxed out, but it looks like we're in good shape. So rather than keep you all waiting, let's begin. Let me welcome everybody. I'm Bill Reinsch. I'm the Scholl Chair and Senior Advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And it's really a pleasure to have you here. I'd like to say that the topic today is a brilliant case of great timing and planning in light of what the administration announced yesterday. But the truth is, it's a total coincidence, but it is timely given the executive order that the Biden administration rolled out yesterday on supply chains, and we're fortunate to have one of the people that is integrally involved in that, and perhaps even responsible for it. We'll see what he says. Here to talk with us, and then we've got a panel of experts that are going to talk about it afterwards. The genesis of this event is a paper that CSIS published right at the end of last year, talking about supply chains in the pharmaceutical sector and proposing a trusted partnership model rather than a total reshoring model. It's a better way to go. And once our guest speaker is finished, Meredith Broadbent, who's one of our non-resident fellows, is going to talk a little bit about what that means. She was the principal author of the paper. And then we're going to discuss the whole issue, including that proposal. But we're fortunate in the beginning to have with us Tim Manning, who has a long title, Supply Coordinator for the White House COVID-19 Response Team, and an even bigger job, because managing supply chains for the COVID response team, if anybody that's reading the papers knows, is a gargantuan task, and trying to get everybody in the country protected and vaccinated is huge, and doing it under literally enormous pressure and crisis conditions. So we're anxious to hear about that. Fortunately, he's someone with a great deal of experience and a lengthy bio, which I'm thinking you can get off of the White House website. Formerly, he was a senior advisor to the Pacific Disaster Center and the president and CEO of Berger & Manning LLC, which is a resilient security and strategic policy consulting firm. Probably more important or more relevant is he spent the entire Obama administration as a deputy administrator of FEMA, which is an agency that I suspect people on this call know well, and which is one in which he handled no small number of crises, disasters of various sorts, cyber and weather and otherwise, and also engaged in a significant number of international negotiations, not to mention negotiations with some of the several states in the United States, because that's what FEMA does, it partners. So we've got someone with us with a wealth of experience that's directly relevant to his job. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tim for his remarks. Go ahead.
Great. Thank you very much, Bill. And thanks, everybody, and good afternoon. So it's great to be here joining you all. I want to thank you for spending some time on this very critical issue. The panel today is really impressive. I'm sure there's going to be robust discussion. So at the White House right now, at the White House COVID response team, we're focused on really restoring public trust and mounting an aggressive, safe response to the COVID pandemic, including an effective vaccination campaign. We're advancing steps we know will stop the spread like expanded masking, testing, social distancing. We're working with states, cities, tribal communities, and the private industry to increase our supply and administer testing, vaccines, critical medical equipment, PPE, and essential medicines, things that will help us reopen schools and businesses safely. And central to those efforts, of course, as you hear often from us, are the notions of equity, ensuring that communities and people being disproportionately infected and killed by the pandemic receive the care they need and deserve. But we're going to focus on the supply chain side of the response right now. And so currently I work with teams across the government, from the Department of Defense, the Department of Homeland Security, and the Department of Health and Human Services to ensure our country has what we need for the pandemic response across the entirety of the supply chain, from testing and diagnostics to vaccine, durable medical equipment, therapeutics, essential medicines, API, finished drug product, and personal protective equipment. As we all know, COVID-19 has laid bare the vulnerabilities that exist on our supply chains and our ability to scale up to respond. And the critical importance of having a resilient and flexible system in a crisis has never been more apparent. It's also provided an opportunity to look into the future and build a system that's more resilient for the next pandemic or the next crisis. We all remember those critical moments in the spring, in the summer, those critical shortfalls in the availability of PPE, and that has yet to be resolved in its entirety. Additionally, as we ramp up vaccine manufacturing to a scale never before done in US history, probably never before done in world history, we're working across a wide field of secondary and tertiary suppliers without whom everything comes to a halt. Raw materials through manufacturing of components to the manufacturing of the finished product, and through distribution, think sand to glass to vials, then filled with vaccine, then capped, frozen, shipped, combined with hundreds of millions of needles, syringes, and then into your arms, hopefully sooner than later. So I want to talk a little bit about what we're doing right now and what you can expect to see from us in the coming months as our efforts can galvanize around strengthening our medical supply chain. So today we spend most of our time focused on our immediate priorities related to supply chain for the COVID-19 response. We're focusing on several efforts. You heard me mention, we kind of think of them as 4 large buckets, and that's vaccine, therapeutics, testing, and durable medical equipment and PPE, and DME and PPE, all of which, as you know, have complex supply chains of raw materials, manufacturing processes, distribution, and global competition and global impacts. We've taken recent actions using the Defense Production Act. You hear us talk a lot about the Defense Production Act and other tools, a wide suite of authorities and capabilities across the government to ensure the US government has the supply we need to support this response. These actions have been used for supplying a range of things. Most recently, we were talking about working closely with Pfizer in their ability to significantly ramp up their production amounts and hit their targets months sooner, getting great number of doses out into the public in advance of where the original plan had been, and working with them to provide things like tangential flow filtration skids, fill pumps, and some of that critical equipment they need to expand the suites to be able to make more vaccine and get it out across the country. We're using these capacities to help build domestic industrial base in things like nitrile gloves, nitrile butyrolol gloves, N95 masks, and the key components that go into the test, diagnostic testing, both in rapid antigen test and PCR testing. And we're using this in combination, we're also using a combination of expertise across the government to facilitate and attempt to smooth the usual challenges to get things made more quickly, distributed efficiently, and into the hands of people on the front line of the crisis. So when you hear us talk about the Defense Production Act, which usually means priority ratings, the ability for the government to kind of jump to the front of the line, that has an enormous impact on our ability to effectively and efficiently get material and supplies out. An important part of that many people overlook is the fact that those ratings fall through to all of the sub-suppliers of that particular vendor. So in the case of, say, Pfizer, when we issue a priority rating for Pfizer or for Moderna, all of their suppliers, that rating trickles down to all of their suppliers. So when they need bioreactor bags, they go to the front of the line with their suppliers as well, which has, as you can imagine, significant impacts down the supply chain for all other global manufacturers. There's other authorities, though, that also help. Things like innovation awards and what looks like a DPA-like authority that resides within BARDA at the Department of Health and Human Services. And even less talked about, but as critical as anything else, is the DPA Loan Authority, which currently resides with the Development Finance Corporation, to help us build new industrial capacity. So the DPA ratings help by going to the front of the line, but what's more important is the ability to make more of what we are short of in the first place. And because, so as important as the expertise the government can bring to bear, from the logistics and procurement expertise of the Department of Defense and the Defense Logistics Agency, as is evidenced through the vaccine operation, but also the domestic operational expertise of FEMA, bringing them to bear, and working with emergency authorities and coordinating the whole of government effort across the Department of Veterans Affairs and the Department of Defense, the Health and Human Services, the whole suite of federal agencies being brought to bear against this problem. And right now, our team's focused on passage of the American Rescue Plan, which you've all heard much about, included in which is a $10 billion line towards called the Defense Production Act. It's called out as a Defense Production Act appropriation for building supply chain resilience, additional manufacturing capacity, sustainment of that capacity, and additional strengthening of a resilient supply chain for critical supplies. Okay, so as we think about what we're doing today to respond today, we are also focused on the future. We can't allow ourselves to be in the same situation we found ourselves last spring against future pandemics or crises. We can't let that happen again. So we need to build the capacities we need here at home, where we're less susceptible to global competition for scarce resources or subject to geopolitical influences or events, and ensure that there are similar capacities closer to home with key allies, both onshoring and nearshoring critical manufacturing. And we must ensure that this capacity is sustainable and sustained out into the future. So, as you mentioned earlier, the president has released multiple executive orders since taking office, two of which, very important ones, focused on the supply chain. First one being on the Thursday, the day after Inauguration Day, Executive Order 14001, which is a resilient pandemic health, public health supply chain executive order, directing a whole suite of a sequence of activities. And then yesterday, an additional executive order looking at key supply chains across the national security and public health space as well. These will help us ensure we take critical steps towards ensuring that America's supply chains can withstand any crisis from any cause. This past year, we saw Americans struggling to access critical goods and services, and that showed us how vulnerable our supply chains are and how in need of a major revitalization over the long term. So as part of these executive orders, my team's beginning to work on a pandemic supply chain resilience strategy. That executive order called for both a short-term, immediate inventory of our on-hand supplies and the models, the policies and planning factors around the determination of how much is enough. But most importantly, a national strategy for a resilient public health strategy, or public health supply chain, which is due to the president in July. Run concurrently will be a national security, a larger supply chain resilience strategy that will be focused on the wider range of things, national security concerns that were in the executive order that was signed yesterday. So just a quick moment coming back a little to home. A big part of supply chain resilience for us means that the US will invest more in domestic production, industrial expansion, reshoring, onshoring, and nearshoring, and ensuring more redundancies, adequate stockpiles, and a capable domestic workforce. As we look at expanding vaccine manufacturing, for example, we need a great deal more people that have the skills to work within vaccine manufacturing than we currently have access to. And so this effort will have a strong global component as well. We know the US simply does not have the capability to manufacture, make, or mine all of the materials and everything that's needed to enter into the supply chain for our critical goods. And we know we're not alone in the threat of COVID-19 and other pandemics. Once we reach, we get those needles into all the arms of all Americans, there are still another 7-some billion people on the planet. The disease is still circulating, variants are emerging. We have a humanity mission at hand as well. And we'll continue to need our allies and partners to ensure the resilience of America, as well as the global supply chains. We'll look forward to maintaining those important relationships. And we're doing this in a few ways. We're exploring diplomatic, security, and trade actions to engage allies and partners to strengthen supply chains jointly. We're investing in global biopreparedness and resilience with internationally focused spending called for in the American Rescue Plan as well. We're also looking at potential reforms to domestic and international trade rules and agreements needed to support supply chain resilience, security, diversity, and strength. We know this effort will rely on strengthened relationships with our allies and partners who share our values. These relationships will allow us to collaborate towards stronger regional and global supply chains, as well as work together towards responding to COVID-19 and future threats globally together. So we don't take this work lightly, and we don't work in a silo. We're looking at these issues through a broad lens, including supply chain risks due to climate change. We're looking at long-term too. For example, the president's called for a supply chain review to be institutionalized every 4 years going forward, a quadrennial supply chain review. The US, the world, we all need a resilient, diverse, and secure pandemic supply chain for our collective health and security. We know there's a lot of work ahead of us, but we're optimistic about getting it done. The COVID-19 crisis has been devastating. It has uncovered gaps in our supply chains we must now close now and for the long haul. And that's what the president is focused on, and that's what he's focused us on. And we're looking forward to the progress on this in the coming month. And again, I want to thank you for allowing me to spend some time with you this afternoon. And thank you for hosting this event. It's work like this that will close those gaps and make us all stronger going forward together. Thank you very much.
Thank you for setting up the conversation. I appreciate it. And it's a good start for where we're going. I think that I'm sorry that you have to leave, but we've got some questions, some of which will be for you. And what we're going to do is send them to you by email, and then you can decide if you want to answer them or not. But right now, we're going to move on to Meredith and to the panel. So thanks again, Tim, and much appreciated. And one of the possibilities is, a few months from now, we may have you back. We'll get a progress report on how everything's going. So thank you.
I'd be very happy to come back, and I'm very much looking forward to the questions and answering them. And I apologize for not being able to stay longer. Get back to the response here. Thank you all for doing this, and I look forward to that.
No worries. Let's turn now to Meredith. Meredith, give people a couple of minutes just on the trusted partnership proposal. Tim referred to reshoring and nearshoring. Tell us a little bit about that issue, and then we'll go to the panel.
Thanks, Bill. I appreciate it. We began our project in August by convening a group of interested thought leaders and industry representatives to assess how U.S. medical industrial base was responding to the emergency caused by the pandemic related spikes in demand. At the time, there was widespread dire concern in Congress and the general public about shortages of pharmaceuticals, medical devices, and personal protective equipment, and a general angst that the U.S. industrial supply chains were failing and that the U.S. industry lacked the ability to produce at the scale necessary to meet U.S. demand. Overall, we expect threats to supply chain resiliency to only increase in the future. The frequency of production and supply chain disruptions will continue for many reasons, such as pandemics, but will also include weather, shipping, labor disruptions, et cetera. McKinsey estimates that companies can now expect supply chain disruptions lasting 1 month or longer to occur about every 3.7 years. A McKinsey survey in May found that 93% of supply chain executives plan to take measures to make their supply chains more resilient, increasing redundancy, nearshoring, and regionalizing their supply chains. McKinsey estimates that 38 to 60% of the pharmaceutical value chain could regionalize in the coming years. Overall, we observed that companies are moving production and adjusting to new threats of possible disruptions, although we don't have a measure of this yet. Just to highlight our recommendations, Congress, we suggest that the Congress and the Biden administration should work together to enact a policy on medical supply chain security centered around diversification with a network of trusted supplier countries that cooperate with the US in order to bolster and guarantee a steady supply of essential medical products in future public health crises. The Trusted Partner Network would offer member countries enhanced commercial ties, reciprocal reductions of trade, investment, and regulatory barriers, and a commitment of support from other trusted partner countries, especially during public health crises. Eligibility criteria for the trusted partner status could include commitments to safety and efficacy of medical products, IP protection, and free data flows. All partners would commit to enhance supply chain visibility, work towards a plurilateral trade agreement for the medical sector, exemplify trust and reliability, and commit to reciprocal support for supply chain security by prioritizing the flow of goods and information sharing during crises. We suggest several possible structures for the Trusted Partner Network, including reciprocal negotiations with interested trading partners and unilateral designation of countries eligible for the network, similar to the GSP program. We conclude that wholesale government mandated reshoring is the wrong approach. OECD models indicate that wholesale reshoring would not improve resiliency or efficiency of supply, largely due to a lack of diversification and inability to tap into a global network of suppliers and producers. This was borne out in our case studies of Gilead, Pfizer, and PPP in ventilator production, where we looked at how the US industry responded at a more firm level. Gilead's experience with ramping up production of remdesivir through its supply chain and global manufacturing network illustrates how a company was able to respond to unanticipated supply chain disruptions and spikes in demand by adjusting sourcing, improving manufacturing processes, shifting production among global facilities, and repurposing and ramping up production facilities in the United States. By supplementing domestic manufacturing with multiple international partnerships, Gilead created a sophisticated network capable of producing large volumes of remdesivir to meet huge demand domestically as well as huge demand globally. Similarly, Pfizer's success with a COVID-19 vaccine was defined by its ability to mobilize global research, its manufacturing footprint, and its international network, which included an essential scientific and commercial collaborator, BioNTech in Europe. Basically, Pfizer constructed two parallel supply chains, one in Europe and one in the US, to ensure scalability and redundancy. In contrast, the strategic national stockpile for PPE was depleted early, for personal protective equipment was depleted early in the pandemic, and shortages in masks and gowns and gloves became apparent and painful. Supply chains for certain PPE were strained due to the overwhelming size of demand spikes and insufficient production in the Western Hemisphere. On the other hand, despite delays, global supply lines for ventilators remained intact. Ventilator manufacturers, aided by automobile companies and others, were able to greatly scale up production, retool factories, and ultimately identify new global and domestic suppliers for component parts that were in shortage.
Okay. Thank you, Meredith. That was very helpful background. Now let's turn to our panel, which is a distinguished one. We have John Murphy, who is the Vice President for International Policy at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, Abby Pratt, who is Vice President for Global Strategy and Chair of the COVID-19 Supply Chain Task Force at AdvaMed, and Jeff Weiss, who's not a vice president, but is a partner and co-lead of the International Trade Policy and Negotiation Practice and Supply Chair Team Lead at the law firm of Steptoe and Johnson, and has had a career also in the Obama administration, most recently in the Commerce Department, addressing some of these same issues. So let me start with a question for all three of you, which I think is sort of a big picture kind of question. What have we learned from last year? We know last year had a lot of problems. They've been spelled out. What have we learned about supply chains? What do we know we need to do going forward? And I'll just stop there. And John, why don't you go first, and then Abby and Jeff can go after that.
Well, thank you, Bill. It's great to be here with you and Meredith. I suppose one quick lesson is that you can't generalize about what went wrong with some shortages and what we need to do to fix them. And just to throw out a couple of examples that I think illustrate this, we've talked a bit about N95 masks and also shortages of nitrile gloves, bad shortages of both, but the realities behind them are really quite different. The International Trade Commission report that came out in December looked at these products and found that, pre-pandemic, 80% of all the N95 masks used in the United States were made here. So it wasn't a problem of production having been offshored. On the other hand, with those nitrile gloves, I think it's still the case that 60% of global production is in one country, Malaysia. So shortages of both, but different underlying realities. And the solution, one of them has to be more stockpiling. Every pandemic preparedness plan going back a long time always said you got to stockpile these things. And we did some, but not enough. So we need to have more stockpiling. But a hard case like gloves, it's hard to know what exactly more needs to be done there. And I'll just mention briefly a third, which is pharmaceuticals. The FDA has an office that tracks shortages of pharmaceuticals, and there's 20,000 FDA approved medicines on the market today. Before the pandemic, there were about 100 out of 20,000 that were in shortage. And after the pandemic, there were about 110 out of 20,000. That's a sector where there's actually very resilient supply chains, and we didn't see shortages outside of a very small number. So there's a lot of misconceptions about how the pandemic played out in different sectors.
Abby?
Thanks, Bill, and great to be here with the panel. Just sort of picking up off of what John said, and also Meredith, I think, made some great points. When you want to think about sort of what were the challenges and what went wrong, it also is important to look at, and this is to John's point about not generalizing, what went well. And I think what we can say from our industry's perspective is that basically that the medical device supply chains did stand the test of time, and we were able to deliver innovative technologies to support the pandemic. If you look at the ramp up of ventilators going from a couple hundred a week to thousands a week in just a matter of time, the example Meredith gave, even on testing, now we're shipping hundreds of millions of tests to the public, and really ramped up there. And even PPE, where there are certainly issues that continue to this day, the ramp up there, the expansion of the domestic production, tapping into the global supply chains has been nothing short of breathtaking. And finally, with vaccine ancillary devices, the ramp up there to meet the needs to administer the vaccine has been amazing. But, obviously, if you've been watching the news, there's concerns and there's areas to focus. And as Tim said, there's things that we would never want to have happen again. And so I think there really has to be, without the generalization, a thoughtful analysis of those discrete specific areas where there were problems. And I really encourage people to take a look at the ITC report published by the International Trade Commission report that was published in December that reviewed the supply chain disruptions and challenges across a broad spectrum of COVID technologies. It's a massive 200-page report, a massive undertaking from interviews and submissions and testimony, but it really digs into the issues in terms of domestic production, imports. And I just like to go through a couple of the top line findings that they had on those challenges. Because I think it's important, and obviously for each technology, it's going to be slightly different, but looking at that overnight surge in demand where everyone wanted the same thing at the same time. And then on top of that, you had widespread lockdowns and restrictions in the movement of people. And this even continues to this day, but the massive decrease in passenger airline travel, the healthcare industry relied on and still relies on the cargo space provided by passenger airlines. So that has been a huge challenge then in the early stages and even to this day. And also as the pandemic made its way through the world, we saw a cascading effect of export controls or outright bans on COVID technologies. So really what we saw is sort of a race to the bottom in terms of walling off and keeping COVID technologies in country. So that's another huge challenge that the report flags. And then just finally, what we also learned from the report and from our members, it's not just about compelling supply and production, it's also about allocation and distribution and that last mile of getting products to patients. And finally, last but not least, and I think we'll talk more about this, but issues at ports, with COVID outbreaks that are affecting traffic there, and then challenges with container congestion and container shortages that is been a real issue this winter. So I'll end it there, Bill, but thanks for the opportunity to chime in.
Okay, Jeff?
Thanks, Bill, and thanks for inviting me to participate. One of the things I wanted to talk about in terms of, I think, lessons learned and also a success story is that standards can be a very effective tool for driving development of pandemic-related products. Standards is a way to design specifications that industry and regulators can work together on and agree on in a consensus process, and they can do so on a faster timetable than regulatory development. And then government can reference standards that are created through that process, which will help to incentivize commercialization. And here's the example I wanted to talk about. So last week, ASTM International published a performance standard for masks. And as everyone knows, we've had shortages of masks. This standard took 7 months to develop. So compare that to a rulemaking process in terms of the time it takes and the need to move quickly in a pandemic. The standard provides minimum requirements for filtration, for breathability and fit, and it's the best part is it's a performance standard, so that's going to promote competition and innovation. Several key government agencies participated in the development of the standard, including FDA, NIST, Health Canada, and then CDC and NIOSH actually co-chaired the technical committee that developed it. So that's the standards development process. And then here's where the federal piece comes in. So in one of the early executive orders when the new administration came in, the administration charged OSHA with considering using emergency temporary standards for COVID, including with respect to masks in the workplace. And under the EO, if OSHA finds that such standards are necessary, it needs to issue them by March 15th, which is coming up pretty quickly. And that would require mask wearing in the workplace. Now, if OSHA were to issue that emergency temporary standard on masks and incorporate the ASTM standard by reference, that instantly creates a massive market for the ASTM compliant masks. And that should generate a surge in mask production, which will of course have a major public health benefit. And the other great part about it is the materials used for production of those masks are different than the materials used to manufacture N95 masks. So the surge won't create a shortage of N95s. So you also know ahead of time that the standard is fit for purpose because you had federal agency participation and leadership in a consensus process, but you had all the other stakeholders as well. And the standard requires testing to labs accredited to ISO standards. So that helps address the counterfeit issue. And that was just a week ago. They're already researching how to shape and inform revisions to it as technology, new information evolves. And then they're putting in place procedures to replicate that. So they're putting together a global PPE collaboration platform at ASTM so that as other issues come up, other standards can be developed. Moving forward, they can address gaps in standardization and promote R&D. So I think it's a really important example of how private sector driven efforts can help lead us out of the pandemic. And I think it's something the White House should consider as it puts together its supply chain strategy.
Is the 7-month rulemaking process a little slow when you're in a crisis?
Well, 7 months is a lot better than 3 years, which is your typical rulemaking process. So again, like if you have a lot of energy behind it, you could probably get it done even faster than that if you needed to.
Okay, one of the things that, one of the words that was mentioned a lot, particularly by Tim, was resiliency, which is a word we didn't hear quite so much before last year. I think everyone knows what it means. One of the questions that has come up really is, are resiliency and efficiency contrary goals? You have to trade them off. Can you achieve both at the same time? What do we have to do to achieve resiliency, and perhaps more properly, do we have to sacrifice other things to achieve resiliency? John, do you want to go first on that one?
So, I'm not sure that that's really what the choice is, resiliency versus efficiency. I feel like this, to some degree, it's a bit of a false choice. I think from an industry perspective, what companies are mostly worried about is disruption. Disruption, if anybody's watched the sitcom Silicon Valley, disruption is held up as, some kind of an ideal that a industry is supposed to love. But, I think what we've seen in recent years is that that's not really the case. The kinds of measures that are often being talked about here, such as Buy American rules or export restrictions, what they do is they interrupt those supply chains, they cut them off. And it's the uncertainty about the new costs or not being able to access the inputs you need that can be more of a threat.
Do either of the other two you want to comment? Abby?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I agree with John, and I think in thinking about this conversation today, and what are some of the solutions? How can we be better prepared? How can we meet the call of the government and try to support them on what they're doing, and and be more resilient? But I think it goes back to my original point that you have to be sure that you're solving for the right problems, because otherwise it's just disruptive. And there's so much excellent work underway looking at this, whether it's the National Academy of Sciences, the ITC work I referenced, but I think you really need to look at these very thoughtful assessments to understand what problems you're trying to solve for. And then I think second, another possible solution is public-private partnerships. We saw how they helped throughout the pandemic to help industry expand domestic production and help companies defray risk so that they would enter into these arrangements that they might ordinarily shy away from. And I think also you have to have mechanisms to coordinate between the public and private sector in real time. We're actually starting to see that happen and pick up just in the last couple of weeks, but we have not seen a lot of that. And I think you need that real-time mechanism to not just respond, but to address these potential disruptions and get things, it's all about keeping things moving. And then finally, we hear a lot about COVID diplomacy, and now we're hearing vaccine diplomacy, and that's the framework with which we work with governments. And I'd like to see, and I think this lends itself to our discussion with Meredith about how we have a more formalized framework, whether it's the rules of trade or international agreements about how we collaborate with our allies and trading partners to keep things flowing and opening, as opposed to walling ourselves and closing up. And I think this is consistent with the spirit of the Biden executive order that came out yesterday and the language that Tim shared, that we can't do everything ourselves. We need to work with trusted trading partners, and we have to bring those less trusted partners or those more difficult markets that we're still reliant on up to a higher standard. So I really support Jeff's comments on standards development as well. So those are just some thoughts on potential solutions and sort of forward-looking ideas.
Well, that's a great segue into a question for Jeff and then on to Meredith. One of the underlying issues that we've been talking about here is where the government fits in and what the role of the government is as either leader or supporter or demandeur or incentivizer or whatever other words you want to use. Jeff, talk to us a little bit about the yesterday's EO and what that says about where the government's going to go on this. And then I think I'll hand it over to Meredith to talk a little bit about the international elements of all this, and then get the panel talking about that. So go ahead, Jeff.
Well, I definitely think it's worth discussing. Obviously, we're all still digesting it since it came out yesterday afternoon, but it does mention the public health industrial base and pharmaceutical supply chains in particular as major areas of focus. I think and Tim mentioned it in his remarks as well. So I think it's really important that it's part of the discussion. And it seems to be the first serious attempt by the US government to develop a comprehensive government-wide policy on supply chains. So that's very notable. And the fact that the president is taking this step so early in his term really underscores how much of a critical issue supply chains are and have become in such a short period of time. One thing that I think is really important about it is that the EO recognizes the need to take a sector-specific approach to supply chains. All supply chains are different. There are a number of factors to account for, which they've included in the EO, and there are sometimes competing policy priorities that need to be addressed. And that, of course, assumes that policy intervention is necessary. And as I mentioned earlier, there are private sector-driven approaches that can work very well. There's a nod in the executive order to the need to collaborate with trusted international partners to ensure resiliency, and that's a word we're going to be using a lot. I think that's an implicit recognition that not every product can be manufactured domestically. I also thought it was interesting that the executive order talks about economic competition as being one of the drivers, but there's a change in tone from what we've seen in the past, and that the executive order doesn't mention any country by name. It doesn't talk about adversaries. It just talks about, here are the things we know we're going to look at. Another thing that I thought was really noteworthy, and I think this actually changed because I think some of us, I think there was a draft that was published, an earlier draft of the EO that was published. And one of the things I think they added was a component on how transportation systems can support competitive supply chains. And I can tell you in my time in government, we dealt with a few West Coast port issues. There's another major issue with congestion at the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach as we speak that we can talk about a little bit more. So it's really important that the Biden team appears to recognize the port and logistics aspects of supply chain. I also think the strategy is very proactive. And again, when I worked on these issues in government, whenever we had a supply chain crisis arise, which typically happened every year, if something happened, we would need to raise the issue with the White House and create an ad hoc interagency team to deal with it. And I felt we were always reacting. And it's clear from the executive order that this is now going to be a White House priority. They're probably going to have a standing team, and they're going to formulate an offensive strategy, which I think is great. All that said, I mean, I think they indicate that they are going to consult with a wide range of stakeholders. And I think they really need to do that to ensure a good outcome because every supply chain is different.
Okay, thank you for that. Let's turn to Meredith. Let's turn to the international issue. And why don't you go ahead with a couple of questions, and then we'll turn to the audience because we've got some accumulation there already.
Okay. Looking at sort of the trusted supply chain proposal that CSIS made, what do you think the main advantages and challenges are to implementing such a scheme from the perspective of U.S. business? And each of you might be able to raise some issues, questions that you would have.
So I'll jump in here. I think international trade agreements often have a kind of a belt and suspenders approach to providing certainty to the market when it comes to some of these issues. Take export restrictions, for instance. The WTO, members of the WTO have committed not to put in place export restrictions, but with certain limited exceptions, which we've seen, for instance, the European Union recently avail themselves of. But what we've seen in the pandemic is that when push comes to shove, countries have been, willing to kind of play a little loose with the rules. I think post-pandemic, setting up a trusted trader kind of network, even if we're just revisiting those kinds of commitments, emphasizing transparency on and sharing information about international production networks and where they lie and who all is involved, and recommitting ourselves to some of those principles, it can have real value in restoring trust going forward.
Good. Abby or Jeff, do you have any comment on that, or should we go on?
Yeah, Meredith, I just would agree with what John said. I think it's critical that we at least start having these conversations and looking at these different platforms and mechanisms to work with allies, and also bring those markets that we're relying on up to a higher standard. And even if we're not able to hammer in some sort of concrete commitment, just talking about standards or regulatory harmonization or government procurement, I think it's really critical. And this has really laid bare the interconnectedness. I think in some corridors, global supply chain is a bad word, but I think, this shows us that, no, we should be leaning into this. We should be working more with our trading partners. And, with partners like India, who we have a strategic alliance with, we're like-minded democracies, but trade and commercial ties have been trickier. We can use this lens to work with them on some of those issues, whether they're standards or procurement or tariffs. So I think it's a great opportunity. I don't think it will be easy, but I think we have to seize this moment, because this really is a matter of national defense and economic integration. So I would agree with John.
Okay. Jeff, did you have anything, or should we go on?
Yeah, just to add to that, I think, and this has been said before, I think you need to start with the question of what's the problem that you're solving for. That's got to be your first consideration. I think, secondly, you need to look at all supply chains are going to be different. And so the factors that you're considering for each one can lead you to a different set of, whether they're policy tools or public-private partnerships, or leaving it for the market to determine. And then I think looking at the full suite of tools and seeing whether we, on the trade side, and see if we can delve deeper in some of these areas, whether it's TFA plus or mutual recognition, tariffs, regulatory cooperation. Those things take time, requires regulator trust, but I know a lot of countries are going to be interested in figuring out how to work more closely with us, and how to make sure that their supply chains are consistent with the various disciplines that I think we're going to be seeing more of, whether it's forced labor or security or carbon footprint. I think there is going to be a lot of interest in working with us on those, and we can make progress on a lot of these trade disciplines. So I think there really is a great opportunity there. And then again, on the public-private partnership side, what can we do on standards? What can we do, for example, on port-to-port collaboration between the U.S. and trusted partners to expedite trade? So I think it's a very exciting time to explore some of these ideas.
Yeah, I would agree. Abby, it was interesting that you mentioned India, because that was one of in our paper, we looked at India as kind of a special case where you have, some new circumstances on more defense cooperation, a new strategic posture with China, and then a lot of interest in India in making reforms to make the investment environment in India more hospitable to new investments that might be coming from elsewhere. Did you have any thoughts about what can the industry and the U.S. government do to raise India's standards in key areas and bring them into the trusted partner network? What do you think it would take?
Yeah, India being India, I think it would be an uphill battle, but I think it's a relationship worth, sticking with and leaning into, even though it has underperformed over the years. The health industry has sort of come together to encourage both governments to undertake some sort of health sector dialogue, leveraging this mutual interest in supply chain. And, you're seeing a lot of similar language out of both governments of wanting to promote domestic production and be more self-reliant. But I think also there's the specter of China and wanting to be less reliant on China. So could it be an opportunity for the two countries to work together and lean into that relationship? Certainly, we're a strategic market for them in terms of pharmaceuticals and APIs, and they're dependent on global manufacturers of medical devices for roughly 85% of their market. So there's this real, possibilities there, but, they're going to need to do more work on standards. They're going to need to do work on regulatory convergence and harmonization. Both sides have issues around government procurement. We're pursuing Buy America. They have their public procurement order. So maybe there's some room there in all of those areas to sort of work together. And also they did some pretty amazing work during the pandemic, ramping up production of PPE, and they became quote unquote self-reliant on PPE for the country. Now, does their PPE meet the quality standards that we'd like to see? We don't know, but that's an area where they can rise to that level, and maybe they are one day a more trusted trading partner. So
Good. John, what sort of incentives do businesses need to maybe reshore to the United States or regionalize more in the Western Hemisphere?
Well, I think that's a great question, and it depends, right? That's kind of one of the big things that we're all saying here. Take generic pharmaceuticals, for instance. The Association for Accessible Medicines has put out a report on this. They'll explain that to build a new facility to make one of their products takes $1 billion in 5 to 8 years. And I think one of the things that they've called for would be long-term guaranteed price contracts for those products, which is not easy and maybe not cheap either. But if that's the goal that political leaders want to set, then that's how you do it. On the other hand, what won't achieve that goal is Buy American rules in this case. And I'm hearing considerable concern about the potential expansion of Buy American that in a different executive order that came out. And part of the reason there is that that dog won't hunt, as they say. The U.S. procurement, federal procurement of medicines is, it's 3 to 4% of the U.S. market. So it's not going to be a sufficient incentive to make a company go about that whole, $1 billion, 5 to 8 year construction. So you need the right tool to the job. You see this in other sectors like semiconductors, where there's a lot of rallying around the CHIPS Act with, some real federal money involved there. So it depends on the sector you're talking about.
And Meredith, I think we need to go to audience questions.
Yeah.
The first one, which was submitted in advance, is how important will transatlantic trade relations be for supply chain security? Is it going to be necessary to adapt regulations in both the United States and the EU in order to address that? Anybody want to tackle that one? Abby?
I would just say when it comes to medical devices, so we produce about 2/3 of the medical devices and technologies that we consume. The remaining third is spread out across a number of markets, but the leading supplier is the EU. So that means they're a critical supplier of US medical technology. So I think that alliance and that relationship is very important. When they initiated their export controls or limitations or restrictions, that has an impact and is concerning. So I think, the TTIP sort of languished, but, that might be something, not TTIP per se, but that relationship through this lens, I think is important to look at least for medical technology and devices, for sure.
Okay, the next one comes from a Canadian uh, who points out the difficulties that both Canada and Mexico had last year in getting an exemption from PPE export restrictions that the Trump administration imposed. And the question is, how can we ensure that America's neighbors don't have to make high-level interventions to get such exemptions in the future if they're necessary, especially.
So
I guess you just missed the question, didn't I? That was
no, I just didn't hear the end. I'll just jump in real quick, Bill. You know, I think procurement's going to be a sensitive issue between the U.S. and Canada. It often is. The Canadians are noticing the Buy American signals coming from the Biden administration. You know, that may be an area where we're ripe for negotiations. There are no procurement provisions in the USMCA between the United States and Canada. We do have the GPA. The Canadians, when they negotiated their trade agreement with Europe, they had a very ambitious approach to procurement, including coverage of their provincial governments. This could be an area where there's interest, and you know, maybe the Biden administration, on behalf of U.S. industry, might be interested in getting better access to Canadian procurement markets as well. So we might see some engagement there.
Okay, the next, yeah, go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, no, I was just noticing one of the Q&As was about the West Coast ports issue and the imbalance there and how to solve that. And I know that, you know, Abby mentioned this earlier, so I thought it would be a good segue. As many of you know, this has been an issue throughout the pandemic. I think back in April of last year, there was a period where at the Port of LA, they ran out of hand sanitizer and they had to make it themselves due to shortages to be able to keep trade moving. And now, as noted, I mean, we have massive congestion at both the ports of LA and Long Beach, which accounts for 40% of our container trade. I think the last time I spoke with someone there were over 50 ships. I think 2/3 were container ships, and then another third were tankers that were waiting to unload. And this is caused by very high demand for consumer goods from the pandemic, since we're all at home ordering things. And so that's created this imbalance between imports and exports, where in a typical time, 50% of the containers going back to Asia are empty, and now I think it's up to 75%. So that means that more ships don't have to unload and reload and come back. They can just unload it, and that's why you have so many ships, waiting to unload off of LA and Long Beach. And the COVID issue is still there because you still have a significant portion of the workforce that has been out sick with COVID. So how do we solve this problem? And I think the first thing we need to do is make sure that the port workforce, and that's not just the longshore workforce, but warehouse truckers as well, that they get priority for vaccinations. We need to make sure that process is really smooth so we can keep everyone on the job. I know at LA, the longshore workforce has already been working a lot longer hours than normal to keep things going. And then we need to get the various players in the port community together to try to resolve these issues. And that might mean diverting some of those container ships to other ports so that they can unload the ships that are already there. I think it could take a month just to unload those, even if you have other ships not coming in behind them. And you need to figure out how to free up space in the warehouses in Southern California and also at the terminals so that the truckers can come in and move the goods out. And there are going to be other port congestion issues in the months and years ahead, as I mentioned before. So we need to develop a long-term strategy, and that needs to include all the major supply chain players. And I was really pleased, as I mentioned before, that transportation systems and their role in supply chains is featured, prominently in the executive order. So I hope the administration will really reach out. But again, this has to be a process where the private sector is very involved in those conversations.
Okay, we're a little bit past our time, but I've got one or two more here. If I beg the audience's indulgence, or if you have to leave, go ahead and leave. This one's from Meredith. Would the trusted partnership model include the same set of countries across sectors, or would it vary by sector?
Yeah, that's something, a level of detail we haven't gotten into. I think so much of this is going to depend on the domestic political processes of our trading partners and who would be interested and who has an interest in collaborating. So I guess my thought would be it would be an overall medical products relationship, but there's a lot of detail that USTR negotiators would need to work out. And we tried to be broad brush to give flexibility and just be an idea generator.
Okay, here's one for John. The question was asked, what is the problem with supply chains? And John said it's dangerous to generalize, but one common problem is lack of visibility caused not by lack of technologies, but companies refusing to invest. Do you have any insights as to why? Or do you agree with the premise?
Well, it's, supply chain is a concept that I think continues to evolve. I predict that a few years from now, we won't call them supply chains, we'll call them webs or ecosystems. And I think that there have been, both for government policy reasons and companies doing it for their own reputational reasons, everyone's trying to get a lot more visibility and transparency into their own sourcing, all the way down, all the way across. But it's not always easy. It's not that simple. And usually at some point, someone walks into the conversation like this and says blockchain, as if that's going to be some sort of magical solution, and it's not. So everyone is making a bigger effort, I think, across industry to understand these things more, but it's going to take time to make a lot of progress.
Okay, sorry, anybody else? This is an interesting one. How would the U.S. propose withdrawal of essential medicine from the coverage of the government procurement agreement reconcile with the Biden administration's efforts to collaborate with trusted trading partners? Anybody want to handle that one?
Well, I'm sorry to monopolize a little here, but it's actually quite problematic, and there's a real contradiction there. That on the one hand, we're trying to end the artificial trade war on our allies and uphold international agreements, to use a couple of phrases we hear often from administration officials, but also this new emphasis on Buy American. The GPA, the Government Procurement Agreement of the WTO, is immensely beneficial to the United States, and particularly in these medical areas where European governments are, using procurement. Procurement in those countries in Europe represents, 20 to 60% of the whole medical goods markets and pharmaceuticals. In the US, it's 3 or 4%, right? We need to hold on to those agreements, not weaken them. The idea that we're going to improve them, I think it's difficult to think that those negotiations could do anything but leave US industry in a weaker position.
And it seems a little at odds to be ordering a huge study of all of these sectors and so forth, and then at the same time continuing on this kind of very expedited renegotiation of the procurement code without sort of some of the bigger decisions being made on what really are the essential products we need to focus on. So I guess I would counsel that they just put a pause on what they're doing on the government procurement code until they've done all the thinking that they need to do in this executive order that just came out yesterday.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I think this shows how difficult it is, even with a different direction. It's difficult to unwind some of these more politically sensitive topics, issues that were begun in the last administration. But one thing I would note for folks is that in the Buy American EO, which does task the FAR Council with developing a rule on procurement, that it doesn't say there will be a final rule. It says that within 180 days, the FAR Council should consider proposing a final rule. And then it says that a final rule, can be proposed if appropriate, based on the evidence collected and national security and other factors. So they're giving themselves some wiggle room. And so for folks that are concerned, it's important to provide comments in that process. It's a regulation that's going to go through OIRA, There's going to be cost benefit analysis. And so there is room to influence that process, and folks should take advantage of that.
Oh, Bill. Oh, no.
Uh,
Hey, Bill.
I'm messing this up today. We're well over time, I'm afraid, so we're going to have to stop. I've gone through the questions, and I'm sending a lot of them to Tim Manning because they really were addressed to him rather than us. Better that he should be on the hot seat than our panelists who've done a superb job. But I want to thank everybody. I want to thank the audience for joining and sticking with us. I want to thank the panel in particular for thoughtful comments. If you haven't seen our paper, look it up. It's on our website. And I think this is something that we're going to continue to monitor. And so you can expect to hear from us again. And probably a few months from now, we may pick up and do this again and see what has changed in the interim, because it's very much a moving target right now. Meredith, do you have any last words?
No, I think the thing I noticed in the executive order last night was, some of the language is changing that the government is using with respect to trade. It's so long been the paradigm of trade equaling positive exports minus negative imports. And I think the executive order and actually Catherine Tai's testimony is starting to really show appreciation for some of the complexity involved in the U.S. production process here. And I think that's a good thing.
Well, and on that optimistic note, we could use one. I want to thank everybody, Jeff, Abby, and John in particular. Thank you for participating, and thank you for your wisdom. And Meredith, thank you for all the work you've done on this project. And to our audience, hang in there, and we'll talk to you again. With that, signing off. Bye-bye.